We have a very interesting session lined up for you, as you can see, called Political Discontinuity, the Impasse in Australian Politics. I'd like to introduce Ian Marsh, who's an adjunct professor at the UTS Business School. See, we do collaborate internally at UTS. Ian's prior appointments have been at Sydney, UNSW and ANU. Last year he completed a report for the House of Commons on public engagement by their select committee system. Ian has also recently co-authored a study on the governance of Indigenous affairs. His most recent book, Democratic Decline and Democratic Renewal, Political Change in Britain, Australia and New Zealand, by Cambridge University Press, I take it. Ian has been educated at the University of Newcastle and at Harvard, and I'd very much like to welcome Ian. Bligh Grant is well known to most of you in the room. I think he's our colleague. He's a senior lecturer here and Deputy Director of Teaching at the Institute for Public Policy, and he specialises in political studies. And he's, in a sense, I think, the discussant for tonight. So it's going to be a conversation between the two of them, and I welcome you all.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you all very much for attending this evening. We thought we'd try something a little bit different. As a non-television viewer for many, many years, my favourite form of entertainment was listening to the radio, and in particular interviews. There's some large benchmarks to set there. If any of you remember Terry Lane on Lane's Company on the ABC, that used to be on After the World Today for many, many, many years. I was a big fan of that show and lots of other shows on the ABC. So we thought we'd try and do that for about half an hour and then throw it over to you guys, okay? It's my very great pleasure to introduce, along with, and to welcome Adjunct Professor Ian Marsh. I have a confession to make. I'd never heard of Ian before this invitation was extended to the both of us. I know, that's absolutely shocking.
Unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. It could be because I'm paid about 99% of my time to bury my head in the entrails of local government reform in this country and elsewhere and not get above and beyond that. But this evening we have the opportunity to discuss, after considering the burning and vexed question of housing in Sydney in particular through Alan's book, to consider the rather small topic of political discontinuities and perhaps continuities and the future of global capitalism. So that's what we've got for the next 45 minutes. And it's one of those topics that we all have quite strong views on. I know that if I'm ever interviewed on, in particular, political discontinuities, because I'm a lazy empirical social scientist, and occasionally people do interview me, I say, don't worry about it. This is all just a blip. Everything's going to be the same. It's fine. We've had Pauline Hanson once. We're going to have her again. It's no big deal. Everyone just relax. On the other hand, Ian has written this profound and extremely well considered, what I would describe as a theoretically beautiful book. I only really read the theory because I'm not really interested in the reality of the situation, but nevertheless it's called Democratic Decline and Democratic Renewal. Okay? Now, to introduce this, I think it's important, okay, that we realise that Ian sets himself two tasks here. One is an empirical one, and that is to say, what's wrong with the world at the moment, okay? What are we looking at in terms of political discontinuity? Ian answers the question very differently to me, that is in a non-lazy way. He looks at things empirically, he doesn't just think about it, tells the media that it's going to be all right. He says that we do have quite a lot of political discontinuity, it is systemic. But secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, Ian and his co-author, whose name escapes me, Raymond Miller, they actually provide some solutions. And I quote from page 3, in responding to this development, that is political discontinuity, this study has two primary aims. First, to explore the origin and trajectory of present political discontents, and second, to suggest how they might be remedied. Now that's a serious, serious goal to set yourself, even if you have it a co-author that works like a slave, which in fact I do for most of my projects. So even if your co-author worked like a slave, even if both of you did, Ian, congratulations, that's a very, very big bar for you to set. And just to show you, that's what Cambridge University Press does to their authors. Isn't that a beautiful book? Okay.
It's Jeffrey Smart, actually.
Jeffrey Smart? Okay. Now, would you like to talk to this slide a little bit, Ian, to begin with? You start off by saying that once upon a time, in all of our living lives, democracy had really triumphed, and now it's not the case anymore.
Well, I think the point there is, you know, over the course of the 20th century, the number of regimes around this world that have got to be democratic has multiplied very significantly. In 1974, 27%, in 2000, roughly 63%. But I guess the argument of the book is that in Britain, Australia and New Zealand, which are the three countries I focus on, this moment of triumph is actually a kind of emperor's new clothes moment. The democracy is in very serious, in a very parlous condition. And that's what the book's all about.
Right, so we look back on people like Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man and things like that and say, we thought you were wrong all the time anyway, and it's just so happened that that's come to pass, as it were.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, I think The End of History always was a piece of hubris.
Yeah. Dare I say, a marketing tool, and an extremely effective one. Something to keep in mind for our next books, perhaps. All right, okay. So before we get into the guts of what's gone on, I suppose, in terms of Ian and his co-author's analysis, let's have a look at this concept of black swans, which in our discussion prior to this little chat, Ian and I have been talking. We've got some very familiar faces up there, of course, okay? Some faces that are associated with populism of varying kinds. What about the non-familiar faces? Like, so we've got the Donald, Bernie, Jeremy, Nige, who I was thinking, looking at this picture, is the kind of guy that, you know, supports Brexit, but at the same time, a certain degree of economic isolationism, but as a true Tory would want his Cuban cigars rolled on the thighs of virgins and, you know, taken to things like that. Marie Le Pen?
Yeah, she could be the second candidate in the runoff in the French presidential elections. And this guy, if Renzi loses this referendum in Italy, will be a very serious candidate. Beppe Grillo, for his party, has done exceptionally well in Italy. So.
All right.
Lots of wild cards.
And what about these people? We know Auntie Pauline, God bless the cotton socks.
Here's Pauline Hanson's counterparts in a lot of... I guess the point of these couple of slides is just to suggest that, you know, the turbulence in Australia, or the uncertainty in Australia, is really not unique to our country. There is a lot of instability in a whole lot of places. So we've got Hanson here. This is the guy from Austria. This is Frauke Petri from the Germans' Action for Deutschland. This is... oh, we moved people around a bit.
Sorry, I'll move them.
That's Vona from Hungary, who's in the government. This is the guy from Poland, who's well and truly in the government running a crypto-fascist regime. This is the Finnish guy who looks a really happy soul. This is Wilders from the Netherlands. This is the Danish guy, and I've lost now who the last one is. But
all right. Now, are all these people right-wing populists, or are they left-wing populists, or are they... can we put them in one particular category, or in terms of discontinuity, or are they disparate and sort of manifestations of political discontinuity in general?
I think what all of them are doing is pitching an appeal to a kind of vision of their countries that's long since ceased to be. You know, it's a kind of vision of a condition of Germany, a condition of Poland, a condition of Austria that's like Farage in Britain. It won't come back, but it's got very deep appeal for people who feel disconnected from the way the world has been going.
So what you've done basically is to gather the empirical evidence to suggest that the generalisation that people make all the time when we've got the rise of populism, which is a very problematic idea, is in fact the reality of the situation. Okay, all right. That's, and there's the numbers, I suppose, which I think are quite extraordinary, that we've got parties polling 45% of the primary vote in Hungary, 38% in Poland, and so on. 35% in Austria, okay? Down here in our little mine cave where we are, exporting furiously, we tend to forget that those kinds of things are going on. And I guess we could put that in the context of populist movements, which we might problematise a little bit later in the discussion, hopefully, in Australia, where Pauline Hanson, I suppose, and parties of her ilk will poll probably about 20% in the next Queensland election, I guess, and are polling about 8%. Nationally, okay, so Ian, what went wrong?
Well,
I mean, my answer to that is quite simple. I just say we had an economic crisis in 2008 onwards. I don't know what other people think, but that would be my answer. But you in the book offer a more systemic account.
So the central argument in the book is, if we want to understand the present discontents, we've got to look back at three really quite distinct big changes that have emerged over the last 30 or 40 years. So I think what we're dealing with at the moment is kind of really a slow burn crisis of democratic legitimacy, whose origins, distant origin, lies in the social movements in the 1970s. There were 8 social movements: the women's movement, the gay movement, the environment movement, the animal rights movement, the consumer movement, the indigenous rights movement. I'm listening to Pete's third one. Anyway, there were 8 that take me on. And all of these, although these movements all had very different focus, causes, all of them involved differentiating identities in some shape or form. So we have a formal political system that was built in in this country took shape in 1909, in Britain in 1919, which was built around class identity and is really the kind of sheet anchor of the political system. And what we saw in the 1970s was an emergence of a whole series of new identities that laid a claim on the political system, sought their legitimacy, their standing through the political system, and we've been living with that transformation ever since. But we've got a formal political system that still pretends that we're locked back in a binary world. This is not a binary society. It's a pluralised society. It's a highly differentiated society. You've only got to look at the issues that have been recently on the agenda to see how persisting the causes of the 1970s are in reframing the agenda. But the formal system still pretends that you can put all these things relatively into a binary.
But I wanted to ask you, I mean, something that's been occurring to me is that that's not the normal story that we were fed at university by the people that went through that Whitlam-esque time. They were sort of exemplars of those social movements in many ways. And some of them weren't, they were entirely retrograde. But the story that they told us was a lot more economic than that. They said, once upon a time we had the 50s, which was about post-war economic expansion, and then we had the oil shocks, the first one and the second one in 72 and 75 or 69 or 72 or whatever, and this meant that basically the price of everything went up. We had a situation where the normal instruments that we use with the economy in terms of controlling demand, the Keynesian language fell apart with stagflation. We went into prolonged recession. In some ways, we've never really got out of it. That was really responsible for all of this stuff. The stuff that you're talking about is, as it were, what structuralists would call epiphenomenal. Is that part of your account as well, or not?
Well,
is it you're really talking about the way that there's a discontinuity between the politics of what people were on about and how it generated from the 70s on the one hand, and the parliamentary system as we know it, okay? And you're saying that the parliamentary system, I'm an intrinsically conservative person, I would say that, at least in terms of analysis, I would say that surely the parliament can cope with those kinds of, surely you've got factions in the Labor Party, you've got factions in the conservative side of politics, they can have their little fights and stuff, but it's just not working. Is that right? Maybe that leads to your second reason, which is political continuity between the two party convergence.
Just on this point about the social movements.
Yeah.
in my take, identity is the fundamental unit in politics. Identity, I mean, if you look at all those populists we saw before, it's identity that they're appealing to. I mean, it's as I said, it's sort of nostalgic identity, but identity is really the sort of sheet anchor of political systems. And of course, a political system is a hugely robust, a hugely well-established structure. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is this disconnect between the formal political system that we have and the identity and the society, the publics, really, that it's trying to manage. Can I just put in another little footnote about these social movements?
Save them for
If there's anyone around who wants to write a book, here is a book I'd love to see written. There were 8 social movements, right? 8 of them. Although the causes that they championed were very, very different, they all had an exactly similar pattern. That is, they all started with a great book, an important book, a kind of Old Testament, secular Old Testament prophet of our time. Up from slavery for Stokely Carmichael for the Black Rights Movement, Unsafe at Any Speed, Ralph Nader for the consumer movement, and so on. Australians wrote 4 of these books. I don't mean to be a little patriotic.
That's okay, it's in fashion.
But we think of ourselves as a very derivative society, no political originality. Well, 4 of what I would claim to be the Old Testament, the secular prophets of our time, the people who helped fabricate the equivalent of the 1848 revolution in the 20th century, 4 of these people are Australian.
I only can think of Germaine Greer, so...
So Greer, she shares the stage with a number of other people, but The Female Eunuch was a hugely important book. I think everyone would acknowledge it. Peter Singer, unquestionably the guy who wrote the book that created the animal rights movement. Dennis Altman, the guy who wrote the book that created homosexual oppression or liberation. And the last one is the one about whom I think is most problematic, but when I was living in the States, Helen Caldicott. Helen Caldicott's book, Nuclear Madness, was the star of the American anti-nuclear movement. So, you know, I think there's a story to be told about Australians. Our formal politics is pretty dreary, but here we've had this, what I would say, enormously influential group. It's not the sort of thing I could ever do. I'm not good enough writing that sort of stuff. But if anyone could write a book about these 4 guys or 4 people, I think there's a...
And be prepared to live in absolute poverty while they're about 2.5 decades of power, and that's really good, and those kinds of things. And, I mean, frankly, that annoys me because I'm quite a libertarian. I think that we vote politicians into power and they should look after it, and then we can go and do whatever we want, make money, you know, or do things like that. Okay, that's just my own personal perspective. But your view of getting to how you want to reform the system is, I think, quite an interesting one. Shall I try and presage it, or would you like to?
I can tell my story.
Yeah.
Well, again, it's this question about going back to historic precedents. In the period 1901 to 1909, we had 3 parties, and quite weak parties. And the Senate acted as the kind of agenda gatekeeper. The bit of the earlier story that we left out was about the decline of the major party organisations. I mean, in their great days, conferences came, you know, the national conferences, the major parties came. Agendas were set at these national conferences. Activists came along and felt, you know, that they had a bit of voice. I mean, these were very important fora. That's all gone. That's all just make-believe now. That's all just, you know, media stunts. So the agenda-setting capacity in our political system has been eroded. But agenda setting is a very critical activity because that's, you know, when the form of a majority coalition starts to take shape. That's when you you know, people say, well, I think this, and the other lot says, I think that, and some other people say, well, it depends how you define the issue. I might support you if you know, put these bells and whistles. So that agenda setting step is a very important one in building a political conversation that has a chance of passing through into some kind of outcome. And in the 1901 and 1909 period in this country, the Senate effectively played that role. The House functioned as the sort of House of Government, and the Senate functioned as the House where new issues were ventilated and tested and either moved on or discarded. And I mean, obviously it wasn't a perfect world, it was only 9 years, but a lot of very important things happened between 1901 and 1909. And you know, to my mind, that's a way that our political system might get reframed.
Just correct me if I'm wrong though, because in the, and this is my last point, I suppose, or I hope so anyway for everyone's sake, you do spruik the value of the committee system, parliamentary committee system, which is quite an interesting heretical idea in the context where everyone, in particular in local government, everyone's been running around for the last 25 years saying we need greater leadership, we need to get rid of committees, we need people to make decisive decisions, we need charismatic leaders, we need to change the structure of committees so that people can make decisions to ensure that there is a functional executive within them and things like that. So it's quite a heretical thing, or oppositional thing to turn around and say people should get involved in the committee system. I'm inclined to agree with you, quite frankly, because I think parliamentary committees are great. Go and give evidence here, and people think that Parliament is just Parliament. But what's your take on just a couple of committees that I've been to? But what's your take on that? Can you flesh that out for us a little bit?
Well, the people have to the system has to connect to its publics. And when you think about how the system is going to connect to its publics, I don't see any alternative to some enhanced role of the committee system. I mean, who knows what the 21st century is going to be like, but a happy story about the 21st century has to, I think, to my mind, say that it has to be a more democratic century. We've got to unfold democracy in a deeper, richer way for the publics in these very mature democratic states. Maybe it won't happen, but it certainly has to be seen as one option. There's a lot of historic background to expect that to happen. So then the question is, how might this happen? How do you create infrastructure that allows the conversation, the political conversation, to be much closer to the publics that it's trying to serve? And that's what I think the committees can do. The Australian committee system is not a very well developed one. It's very adversarial at the moment, although there's some examples. But the British Parliament does come in terrible shambles right now, but the Parliament nevertheless does have some examples of very effective, good constructive inquiries that keep sustaining my hope that this could be the way to go.
Okay, that's the good story at the end of the rainbow. We've covered a lot of ground through your text, and I hope I haven't obfuscated any of that through my interjections. What do you think of this idea that, firstly, democratic discontinuity? Are we a bit cynical about this idea like me? I think everyone's going to fix it. Maybe I'm just too conservative. Do you think we are facing a crisis of democratic representation? Does it make any sense to you? Do you just want to throw stuff at us, or what? Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
I came in a bit late, so I was thinking about Helen's book, so sorry. I might have missed, but you didn't cover, I don't know if the book does it now, I'll go and Google it when I get home.
It's too expensive.
Too expensive, okay, well, I get through the library. What's known as the non-government sector, because I think in bringing up the issue of social movements, we need to remember that social movements very much overlap with what was called the non-government sector, the community sector. It's called all sorts of things. Feminism, women's legal centres, women's health centres, and on the list, and women's refugees, on the list goes. And what's, of course, happened is they've either been defunded, demoralised, or they've basically been taken over by government as an arm of service delivery, and certainly not advocates or lobbyists, and certainly not protest movements. So that whole area that really was about the administrative side of social movements has just gone, or gone to the big charities, the big conservative charities. It's just been wiped out. And it's very hard to get that going. So that seems to me very important, because as we know, change doesn't just come from the top down too, it comes from the bottom up. And really I'm just trying to think, you know, in recent months, what's going on in this city, and the most prominent topic, issue that I can think of has been the students and the art college issue. But that's actually very small, and and it's students and one limited thing. So it's about also radicalising people who feel completely disillusioned, as in the Trump voters or the Hanson voters, and so on. There used to be a housing movement thinking about increasing, public housing, or social housing, community housing, and so on and so forth, saving housing. So I think that's an issue that we need to look at, particularly those of us working with young people in universities who are completely disillusioned and certainly don't get involved in much at all. I mean, I have social work, and they don't get involved in stuff then, because they say, well, that's illegal, isn't it? There's all this, there's been such a dampening down of any protests that students are terrified to move, because they think whatever they do might be illegal. So, just throw that one over to you in terms of the non-government sector, the sector outside government, and whether
well, I'm not as pessimistic as that. I think there's still lots of activism. I agree with you about government's efforts to contain NGOs, advocacy, and all that kind of stuff. But there's still a lot of, there's still quite active, ACOS is still pretty active in the space. And of course the causes I'm talking about are still there. I mean, the gay marriage, live cattle exports, factory fish.
We used to be opposed to marriage in feminism. It's a big problem there, anyway.
The organisation that really fascinates me is GO. Had a bit to do with GO over the last couple of years. It is an amazing, I think it's a typical, it's a very interesting, cutting-edge kind of way of mobilising people around politics. People don't care about, people are disenchanted with the big parties these days, but they do care about issues. And GetUp is a kind of broker on issues. You can go on there and give your money to, you don't like live cattle exports, or you want the barrier reef to be defended, or you're in favour of marriage equality, or you really get agitated about refugees. It's a vehicle for mobilising people around, and it mobilises a hell of a lot of people. Cory Bernardi is now trying to do the same thing on the conservative side. So I haven't lost hope in civil society.
We've got a couple more questions now, which is pretty good. So we'll just press on. Nicole, did you have a comment?
I had to introduce yourselves. Many of us know everybody, but not everyone.
That's true.
Well, Nicole Campbell, humble student at UTS, and at Urban Growth, New South Wales. So Alan's book launch was very interesting. I had two questions I want to pose. The first one, well, I guess more a comment. I think that the vast majority of work done in the Parliament is actually done through committee structures. Through committee structures. And I think that a lot of disengagement in politics, the only thing you see on the news is the adversarial contest, which is very choreographed, of question time. But actually, at a committee structure through House of Reps committees and also the Senate, I think that there is, an opportunity for NGOs and for other interest groups to actually advance policy. And I think that there is actually a much higher level of bipartisan cooperation at a committee level than there is in the choreographed theatre of question time. So I'm a big fan of parliamentary committees in terms of advancing a policy discussion. And I think that NGOs and the like have become much more savvy in understanding how you work through a committee structure. So that was my comment. My question relates to your comments related to Get Up. And I wonder, yes, you know, you get a Get Up thing on, turns up on your Facebook feed, and click here, sign a petition, blah, blah, blah. I worry a lot that that people today, in terms of, you know, they don't take to the streets so much, they'll click on a petition and say, yep, I don't support this or that or whatever. But that seems to be, okay, well, job done. I move on to the next busy thing in my life. You know, I sign the petition, I feel warm and fuzzy. And I wonder, is there actually, you know, is there a need to move Get Up beyond just a vehicle that's primarily located in social media to real grassroots activism? And I'm thinking about local governments and you know, how do you mobilise? How do you actually move people from the social platform to effecting real change on the ground in their community?
So I wrote an essay with Sam McLean, the former boss of Get Up, arguing that this organisation is now forced into a reactive mode. If the political system was more open, it could be much more constructive, it could be a more proactive mode. It has no chance of being proactive at the moment because the political system doesn't let it get in on the game. It's a ready-made vehicle for engaging people, you know, proactively on the issue if they felt their voices could have some impact on the way the issue was going to be unfolded. For those who are interested in local government, I just wrote an essay for a fetch strike for somebody in Britain, David Markland, and one of the aspects of this essay is devolution in the UK. I just looked at the Communities Committee, the Public Accounts Committee, the National Audit Office reports. I mean, there is an incredible wealth of material there about the Conservative government's very rapid imposition, attempt to introduce devolved governments in the UK. You want to see, again, how committees can be a terrific resource, I think, in the ways you see.
Okay, we'll move on. Alan, Professor Morris. Did you have a question? Time for a drink? We've got time for one more question. There's a couple.
Yeah, be really quick. A couple of questions and comments. My name is Greg McLean. I'm from the Australian Service Union National Office, but I've recently just been elected to Sutherland Shire Council. A few things. I'm not so much a doom and gloom. I think we're actually on a bit of a cusp of people learning how to participate more because the tools have become available. One, committee structures, I think, are absolutely critical. Doesn't matter whether you're one or two, three people, a small organisation, a big organisation, you can put a submission into a parliamentary committee, the same as BHP can or a state government can. Committee structures, I think, are fantastic. We have a good reputation for those things. And the fact that they're able on board, people seek participation from a broad range of political parties that sit on them, gives great confidence and great ideas. I think we've actually had some good changes in changing political parties' views of late, not enough. If you look at what the union movement's done, say in New South Wales, was changing the Labor Party's views in respect of privatisation, totally the opposite to where we were with carbon leaving, for instance. And I think we'll see more of that. The Bernie Sanders issue in the US, really critical thing. This guy walked around, did a magnificent campaign until I almost got there. And then you saw in the UK an opportunity that the parliamentarians tried to oust the Labor Party of Bligh, and the party and the great involvement is to say no. And I just think people are starting to use more of those tools of social media and others to get their view across. I think people are just campaigning differently to how they used to in the old days. I just think there's huge opportunities out there that we're just starting to pick up on. The other issue about the political parties being the same, I think that it's the little person in the street or the people that vote out there mobilise the view to change those. I know in the recent elections in the Sutherland Shire we had a dramatic change from political parties across the Shire, and during the campaign there was not one person who didn't come up to me and talk to me about development in the Shire, the fact that it was they want this and that, they want that and that. It was all about issues that were affecting the street.
All right, that's...
Could I just make a point about social media? A lot of the involvement, a lot of the engagement, now certainly this was certainly true in the UK, a lot of engagement is broadcasting out. Political engagement is reciprocal. You've got to create reciprocal engagement. Brits are doing an experiment with this.
I don't want to stand between the tired and hungry crowd and some food and some alcohol. I think I can twist Ian's and Bligh's arms to hang around for a bit in the room next door so we can continue the conversation and eat and drink. I'd really, really like to thank you for a really incredibly stimulating discussion and raising very important